Hey, it's Verity here from the creative team and welcome back to the Wow Embossing Powder YouTube channel. Today I have 3 cards for you where Grunge meets whimsy, combining Wow Metalz Trio by Seth Apter with some really whimsical stamps from Hero Arts. I'm also including a technique using dye inks to block stamp the backgrounds. So let's get started. So as I said, I'm going to do some dye ink block stamping, so I need a variety of different shape acrylic blocks for this, and I'm also combining it with a variety of different Metalz dye inks, along with the Wow Metalz Trio from Seth Apter. So to start off with, I'm going to create the background for the starry card. So this is creating quite a whimsical night sky, and for this I'm using Juniper Mist, Queen for a Day and Sangria ink from Metalz. So to start off with, I am just adding some of the ink directly to my acrylic block, and I'm using a sort of thin oblong acrylic block here, and this is a acrylic block I think from Juniper. And then once I've added Sangria to one end, I'm then adding some Queen for the Day in the middle, just overlapping it with Sangria, and then I'm adding some Juniper Mist to the end of the acrylic block. And once I've got a really good coverage, I'm then just using my water bottle to spritz the acrylic block just so that the ink beads up, and I've got a lot of the ink mixing with one another to help blend the ink. Okay, so for this first background, what I did was I placed some watercolour cardstock over the top of the block with the ink facing upwards to me. Obviously I couldn't quite see where the block will land on the card, but I was quite okay with this. And I'm just pressing it down, holding it there in place so the watercolour cardstock soaks up the dye ink water combination that I created on that acrylic block. Now as you lift up, you get to see the beautiful colours blend with one another, and then all I'm going to do is just dab off any of the excess ink where there's a lot pooling up. Now you can leave it to dry naturally like that, but it will create and dry at different rates because there's different amount of liquid on the background, and you'll get a bit of a sort of mottled look to the background. Okay, so for the second background we are going to create that sky for the moon and stars, and this time I'm using Juniper Mist on one end. So I've got a larger acrylic block here, which is again I think one of Gina K's acrylic blocks, and then I've got suede shoes that I'm adding in the middle, and then I'm adding stone blue down the bottom, which is quite a light blue ink. Again, once all inks were then added, I'm spritzing with my water bottle again, giving it a good spritz to start beating up the colours and allowing them to mix. And then once I've got them all on, instead of placing the card onto the acrylic block, this time I am placing the acrylic block onto my watercolour card. Now, doing it this way, you don't want to have too much water pooling on the acrylic block, because as you flip it over, it will drip. With this one, there was less water on there, so there were a few areas where I didn't get the colour. And I wasn't too fussed about this because actually, it gives it a really textured look to the background, and it looks like it's got its own clouds within it. Okay, so for the last background, I'm using a circle acrylic block from Metalz, and this time I'm adding Sangria ink to one end, Tiara ink to the other end, and then I'm adding Mandarin Spice in the middle, allowing again the colours to overlap. So this is going to give a really lovely sunset sky. Once I've spritzed the acrylic block with water, again I'm then flipping it over and placing it down onto my cardstock. This one blended really well, and I got a really good shape to the ink damping. And then the excess ink, again, I just used a paper towel just to mop up the excess so that I get a nice smooth even blend without it drying mottled. So as you can see, the 3 backgrounds, I've got 3 different kind of colours and skies to my backgrounds, 3 different shapes and quite a lot of different texture within the cards. So these were really great and fun to create. So the stamp set I'm using here is the Hero Art You Are My Universe, and I'm using the stamp set as well as the die set. So for this first card where I created the lovely violet midnight sky, I'm using the Wave of Stars stamp and placing this across the ink block stamping, as well as allowing it to overlap the edges. Once I've placed it in my Misty, I'm then inking it up with my Wow Clear Ultra Slow Drying Embossing ink. I'm stamping this a couple of times because it is watercolour card, so it's a bit of a rough texture. Once I've done that, I'm then covering it with weathered gold embossing powder from the Metalz trio inspired by Seth Apter, which is a lovely gold colour with some darker speckles within it. It gives it a really sort of aged look to the stars. And I think this looks really lovely and natural. So once I've covered that embossing powder, I'm not heat setting it straight away. I'm placing it back into my misty stamping platform. And then I'm just repositioning these stars slightly offset from one another to then again ink up and stamp in my Wow clear ultra slow drying embossing ink. And then I'm going to cover it again in the same weathered gold. So I keep repeating this down the card, offsetting these stars at different points to get variety. And once they're all stamped, I'm then going to heat set it all in one go. Doing it all in one go just reduces the amount the cardstock is going to warp as you're heat setting it. This, I think, is such a lovely background, and it's such a lovely whimsical feel to it with the colours from the inks in the slock stamping, as well as that lovely textured look in the stars from the weathered gold embossing powder. So for the second background, the more sunset looking block stamping, I'm going to add, first of all, I made a sort of mistake. Well, not quite a mistake, I just changed my mind. So initially I stamped the clouds directly onto the block stamping, and then I'm covering this in the etched embossing powder. After I'd covered this in the etched embossing powder, I then heat set it and decided that the clouds blended into the background a little bit too much. So instead of stamping them directly onto the card, I decided to then stamp them on some additional watercolour cardstock. And whilst I was doing this, I also stamped some of the stamps for the last card. So here I've got the moon, the stars, the sun, and quite a few of the clouds. And I'm just stamping this onto another piece of watercolour cardstock. I've done it on watercolour cardstock so all the cardstock colours blend in, so I've not got a bright white against the slightly more muted cardstock of watercolour card. But also I'm going to add some colour to my stamping images later with my Zig Clean Colour real brush markers, and they work really well on watercolour cardstock as well. So I have covered the sun and the clouds instead in crusty copper. Originally I was doing etched platinum, but I changed my mind and went for crusty copper. I also then covered the moon and the stars in etched platinum for the other card. Once I'd done all the stamping, I then used the coordinating dies to die cut them out, and then I'm just having a bit of a play around with the composition of the die cuts on the backgrounds and to see how they work, and they work really well. As I said though, I wanted to add a bit of colour to the stamping. So what I'm using is my acrylic block as a little palette really, and I'm adding some of my colour from my Zig Clean Colour real brush markers down onto the acrylic block. And then I'm just spritzing it with a bit of water and then adding that on over my stamped images. So for the sun, I used a variety of yellows and oranges, adding more of the darker shades around the edge just to give it a little bit of more dimension. And that ties in with the colours used on the background as well, which of course are the colours you'd expect from a sun. But as well as that, I wanted to add a little bit of colour to the clouds, and because I've got such a vivid orange sunset, I've added touches of the orange and yellow just to the shadows of the cloud, just to get it to tie in as well. Now when it came to the moon and the stars, I just kept it quite simple, and for the moon I'm using a selection of greys, just adding some shadows around the edge and just darkening up that edge to give it a bit more definition. And I'm also using greys on the clouds because it's much more of a duller background. It's going to give that more night sky look to it. Once I was happy with them all, I then adhered the backgrounds onto matching card bases. First of all, trimming each of the panels down so that they had a bit of a border. For the moon background, because I hadn't got it quite straight in my panel when I stamped it, I just trimmed it down and then added it to the card base. All the additional elements that I stamped and die cut, I foam mounted onto the cards to give it a bit more definition. And then lastly, I stamped the sentiments from the same stamp set onto the cards. Now I placed them back into my Misty when I was stamping these because I didn't really want to get my stamping messed up as I'd come so far, and I just stamped these in Midnight ink by Catherine Pooler, which is a nice vivid strong black ink. Then to finish them all off, I'm just adding some clear Nouveau crystal drops. This is in Morning Dew, just scattering them around the card, helping them draw them in. And I went for a nice clear drop, just not to detract away from the vivid colours of those backgrounds and the whimsy feel of the card. I love how I use these metal trios that tend to be more suited for a mixed media look, but pairing them with a whimsy style card, they can really add so much interest. So even if you're not into mixed media, don't dismiss the Wow Metalz trio by Seth Apter, because they are really great powders to use and so versatile. And it's great to have a slightly different look to your metals in your card now and then. I mean, we all love metallic embossing powders, they are fantastic, but it's great to have a bit of variety and interest. If you're interested in any of the products used in today's cards, just see the description box down below and there's a variety of links to these products. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up, and why not think about subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to check out my personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I have included a link here as well as down below. For 10% discount at the WOW shop, just use the code you can see on screen. We'd love to know which out of these 3 cards you like the best and which is your favourite WOW Metalz trio. Until next time, happy crafting!